Of the models of development video lecture or lecture that we did in class. And in class, we talked about all the different features and attributes of self-sufficiency. So I'm going to move on to issues that self-sufficient economies face. And this is one of the, these are the reasons why we don't see a lot of countries using them today. Typically, they're very inefficient. And what I mean by that is if you have industries that are so protected by government, then they don't have a lot of motivation to produce high quality goods and services, knowing that no matter what happens to them, they're going to stay in business. Furthermore, with such high tariffs, there's not a foreign competition. And so without that competition, it really doesn't force the domestic producers to have to make very good products if they know that that's all their people have to choose from. Now, inevitably, people are going to demand goods other than what their country produces, and they're going to figure out a way to get them somehow. And so we always see in these self-sufficient economies a tremendously widespread, rampant black market. And black market just means illegal trade. So any kind of things that are produced or goods and services bought that are not regulated or officially kind of like okayed by the government. Next, because unemployment is, the government tries to reach a zero unemployment rate, you're going to be creating and giving jobs to people. And because you want them to stay employed, you're going to create a system where if I'm working, I know that no matter what, my government wants to keep me employed. What's my motivation to work very hard if I know that I'm going to get paid no matter what? And so you end up getting a system where people a lot of times have jobs just because the government's giving them jobs, not necessarily because they are qualified for them. Next, if you have so many people that are paid by the government, you're going to have this large bureaucracy. And so it's a big system where you have a lot of people whose jobs are dependent upon the government and government paychecks, which means you're going to have high taxes. And typically speaking, that's why we talked about in a system like this, the wealthy get taxed the most. And then, the poor, the lazier people, they benefit from this system as a result of this large bureaucracy. Inevitably, the system breeds corruption. We know that if we have, government workers, let's say, and I'm just going to make up an example. I used this in a couple of my classes, but let's say that I have an inspector that works for the government, and they're supposed to inspect meat packing plants so that the meat that is packaged for people is safe and good to eat. And so I go in there and I'm a meat inspector and I find violations, and I'm going to write up the plant owner for the violations. And the plant owner says to me, hey, look, I know you don't make very much money. Here is $25,000. Why don't you just look the other way? And when you have a situation like this or a system like this is not good for consumers. It's not good for the people. And that's what this kind of system can do. Okay, so we took a lot of time in class this last week to cover self-sufficiency. Now we're going to cover the opposite of that, which is the international model of development, international trade model of development. And so if you're kind of making the connection throughout this is, oh, this is kind of like capitalism. Well, yeah, capitalism is a version of the economic model of international trade. And so if you decide to use this particular type of model to try to develop your economy, you've got to do a couple things. One, you have to identify within your country what are your exploitable assets, and you might only have a couple, but do you have a particular raw material that you could generate wealth from? Do you have a particular skill, or for Singapore, it's their general location. They are located right perfectly at the mouth of the Strait of Malacca. So whatever it is, you have to identify that. And you have to say, okay, well, how can we generate wealth off of it? Now, if you're going to be engaged in international trade, then you're going to identify what you have that is complementary to the world market. And what I mean by that is, what do you have that other countries either don't have at all or they don't have enough of? And so if I'm Saudi Arabia, right there, they have oil, and other countries either have it, like the United States has it, but we don't have enough of it. Or maybe countries like Japan really don't produce any oil at all. That sets up a system of what we call complementarity. Okay, so complementarity exists when you as a country have something that other countries need that they either have a little bit of but not enough of, or they don't have at all. and use oil as your example for that. Second thing you have to do is that you must recognize that you are going to be competing likely with other countries who produce the same thing. And so why is it that other countries buy your exploitable asset and not other countries? So if we go back to Saudi Arabia, we recognize that Nigeria, Venezuela, the United Arab Emirates, there's a lot of other countries that also produce oil. So why buy Saudi Arabian oil? And for them, their answer is that they just have so much. Their supply is so big that they can really produce it and then sell it at a pretty low cost. That's what we call their comparative advantage. Switzerland, they make extraordinarily well-crafted watches. So it's not that their good is cheaper than their competitors, is that the quality is higher. So think of this as you're going to go apply for a job, and there's going to be other people that are applying for the same job. What is your comparative advantage? Like, why are you better than the other person? That's kind of what you're kind of convincing your prospective employer of. Why should they hire you over that other people? Those other people. That's really your comparative advantage. Okay, and that's what a country has to do. How are we going to compete out there? How do what we do it better? Okay, next thing. Once you start exploiting your assets, whatever those assets may be, as a country, you need to be smart about that. You need to, and even really before you can exploit those assets, you have to create a situation where you can exploit it. Like if you're going to be an oil producing country, it's probably in your best interest to provide an infrastructure of pipelines and roads and ports that allow you to do this. And so you need to take the wealth that either you're going to make or you're making off your exploitable asset, and you need to invest it in your country in a couple of certain ways. One of them would be education. Make the next generation of your children more educated, more productive, and that way they're going to get paid better. They're going to spend better. It's going to be better for your economy. So if you take a look here, I've got some sectors that it probably would be smart if you're a country to help your people to live better than they are today. So if you invest in infrastructure like sewer pipes and clean drinking water, well, then your life expectancy is probably going to go up. Invest in a good healthcare system, have a military to protect your trade. All of these things are going to be things that are smart to invest in as you exploit your whatever assets you have. All right. So in geography, we have kind of a game plan of how we do this. And there was a geographer by the name of Walt Rostow, and he created an economic development model based on the international trade approach. And we kind of know it as Rostow's model of development. And so he identified kind of 5 stages that every country that uses international trade will kind of go through, and sort of some of the things that you need to do in those stages to be a successful country. And so we start off with stage 1, which is kind of where everybody starts, and that's the traditional society. So we're talking about everything from at base hunting and gathering to, hey, you've at least got basic agriculture, but the primary focus here are primary industries. You're really not taking your exploitable asset and adding value to them. You are just extracting raw materials. And so in the traditional society, this means that the bulk of your people are engaged in primary economic activity, and you're really not manufacturing. You haven't industrialized yet. All right, so we want to develop. So how do we do that? Well, we need some things to happen. We need what Rostow would call preconditions for takeoff. So first and foremost, you need to identify what you have that's complementary. You need to identify what you have as a comparative advantage over other countries, and you need to create a situation that will allow you to exploit those assets. Now, along with this, you need visionaries. You need a group of individuals that have a vision of the direction that your country should go. And so if you take like the United States, we had Alexander Hamilton. Alexander Hamilton is largely responsible for the American economy as we kind of know it today in terms of the direction we took in capitalism. And he just had a vision of what he wanted the U.S. to be like. And then he worked very ambitiously to make sure that happened. He created high tariffs to protect manufacturing, a Bank of the United States to finance development, And he did all these things to put us in a position where we could eventually, take off. And so again, when we talk about preconditions for takeoff, you need to write down that you've got to set up a situation where that asset or assets that you have can be exploited. So like I talked about with oil, you need to build infrastructure, you need to build pipelines, you need to build good ports so that when you start exploiting that asset, you're really rolling. Okay. So then we can take off, and really take off is kind of a synonym for you can industrialize. You can start manufacturing goods, you can start adding value to your exploitable assets, and this is where we see a great expansion of your economy. Now remember, from a pie piece standpoint, if we look at the sectors of employment or sectors of economic activity, once we take off, we should start to see that primary sector start to decrease because farmers are going to have more technology to produce food. We're going to see the secondary sector start to increase as more people work in factories like the one you see on the screen. And then because people are going to have more money, because those manufacturing sectors are going to need certain services like accounting, like efficiency, research and development, we're going to see what we call ancillary jobs created as a result of those manufacturing jobs. And so we get more service jobs, we get more tertiary. So our service sector, our tertiary sector should be increasing. Okay. Rostow then talks about how economies will get to a point as they've industrialized to where their economy starts to change a little bit. And so that the nature of your manufacturing changes. So in the United States, a good example of this is when we started focusing more on high value added goods compared to low value added goods. The American worker has become productive enough to where we can't pay them really cheap wages. Now, keep in mind that our government's developed enough too that we've created laws about minimum wage laws and stuff like that. But if you take a look at, like a textile manufacturing plant, when we're creating clothing, the American worker is too expensive. And so there's just not enough profit margin in that. And so we start doing things like outsourcing. So this is what we see in what we call our drive to maturity. So there's some hallmarks of your economy and the drive to maturity that you should probably get written down. One of them would be that we start to see our manufacturing sector top out, and then we start to see it decrease. We've got outsourcing going on. We've got more machines doing work of the humans. We start to see that the things that were the backbone of our economy. At first, we only had maybe a couple of industries. Now we have a diversified economy. Now our economy is not dependent upon one or two major industries like it was when we took off. Now we've got 10, we've got 20 major industries, and our economy is a lot more stable as a result. Okay. But what we're really seeing in that drive to maturity is this growing tertiary sector, right? A really shrinking primary sector and a really growing tertiary sector. And so then when we get to stage 5, which is kind of the end of this process, now we have gotten to the point where we are what is called post-industrial, and we are mostly an economy driven by consumption, by spending. Our economy does well in the United States when we spend a lot. And so if you're thinking about in terms of, well, how is this possible? How does our economy not get driven by what we make necessarily, but by what we spend? Well, think of a company like Amazon or Walmart. They are, just ginormous companies. And think about what do they produce? Like, what do they make? And the answer is relatively little to nothing at all. They don't really make anything. They just sell stuff. Okay. They're a fence. They are a way for us to get stuff that we want to get. And so that's kind of what our economy starts to develop into. And I do want to be careful here because we are still manufacturing. And I think it's important to write down under the age of mass consumption that we are still manufacturing. But it's what we're manufacturing that's important. And that is high value added industries. So things that the raw materials, what they're worth compared to the finished product, are way different. So you take like a computer chip. A computer chip is just silicon and molybdenum and all these minerals. And by themselves have value, but not that much. But once you turn them into a computer chip, then the value goes up greatly. And so when we talk about the age of mass consumption, yes, our economy is driven by what we spend, but it's also, we still make stuff. It's just we make good stuff. We make stuff that makes a lot of money. Okay, so that's Rostow's model of development. Here we talked about Saudi Arabia. I won't take too long on this, but they were smart. They started exploiting their oil. They were able to build these, wide roads for their infrastructure. They made sure that they had sanitary conditions. You can see here it's very clean. That makes life expectancy goes up. You can see they put in like a kind of a light rail subway system for transportation. So they really did a good job of taking the money they were making off their oil and reinvesting it into their country. All right, next idea that we need to look at is the core periphery model. So the core periphery model, for your definition for it, it is a model in which we look at how the MDCs, so the so-called core, exploit the LDCs, the so-called periphery. And the kind of the examples of how the MDCs exploit them and continue to get richer off the LDCs are about what they do in terms of exploiting them for cheap labor, in terms of things like brain drain, right? If I'm an LDC and I'm a smart person in LDC, I'm going to be able to make more for my skills in an MDC, and so I'm going to leave and move to an MDC, and that's kind of another way of MDCs exploiting the LDCs. We're going to talk about something called the World Bank. The World Bank is the financial arm of the United Nations, and most of the countries that put money into the World Bank, well, they're MDCs. They're the ones with the money, and then they loan that money out to LDCs, and if the LDCs can't pay them back, they'll do structural adjustment programs. And this gives them economic control over those LDCs. So that is the core periphery model. So remember, this is kind of related to the North-South divide. You can see there that the countries that are inside that red line, those are the core countries, and then the countries outside of them, they are on the periphery. Now, many people would argue that the core periphery model is stagnant. Many people would believe that there's no hope for the LDCs, but I'm going to talk about here in a little bit how that's not true. But what I want to finish with the core periphery model is to talk about how, even though these LDCs buy, let's say I'm a manufacturing company and I put a factory in China, even though that I'm exploiting China for cheap labor, those people are, they are gaining in terms of wages. Their standard of living is going up very slowly, but it is going up. But we have a term for this, and it's called uneven development. And while the MDCs in the core exploit the periphery, they are developing really fast. And the companies and the countries that are in the periphery, they are developing, but at a much slower rate. And, you kind of think about, how quickly Jeff Bezos or Elon Musk, how quickly they're gaining wealth to the rest of us. I mean, really, America's standard of living is going up, but it's going up a lot faster for people like that. Well, that's what's happening in the core periphery model. And the core periphery model just argues how the core gets uneven development, gets richer at the expense of the LDCs. All right, but it is not impossible, and we have several examples of countries that were able to work their way from the periphery and are now kind of members of the core. And so the first one I want to talk about is Japan. Japan was an economic disaster after World War II, but we kind of helped them to rebuild their economy. We kind of taught them how to teach, how to make electronics and automobiles, and by the 1980s, they probably did that stuff better than us. The Japanese were willing to work really hard, and they were willing to get exploited for a certain amount of time. They were willing to, only pay their workers low wages, but those people that worked really hard, and so they were able to kind of come up. And like I said, by the 1980s and 1990s, Japan had kind of worked its way into the core. Well, a more modern example of that are the four Asian tigers or four Asian dragons. So the four Asian tigers or dragons are examples of countries who have worked their way from the periphery to the core. And four really good examples for you to use are Hong Kong, Singapore, Taiwan, and South Korea. Now, Hong Kong, they moved themselves into the core by becoming a world international, financing center. So like an investment banking is basically how they kind of brought in money to their area. Singapore, they did it more as trade. So they used their relative location at the Strait of Malacca, and they invested in their ports. They made it, really easy to kind of get in and out and on your way to the rest of Asia. And so they did it more with trading. Taiwan and South Korea, mostly manufacturing. The United States, for example, exploited Taiwan for a long time in the production of clothing, especially. And so, they were exploited for a time, but now they have worked their way up into the core. And so now they are MDCs. So it's not impossible. It's not impossible for these countries to move up from the periphery to the core. This is what India and China are doing right now as we speak. They have been exploited. They've been part of the periphery, but they are working themselves very quickly up into the core. All right, last part here. There are issues or problems with the international trade approach. One of them is uneven resource distribution. What if you're a country and your most exploitable asset is, like, I don't know, growing bananas? That's not exactly oil. That's not exactly, military technology or things, computer technology like the United States has. What if you just don't have a lot of complementarity? What if you don't have a lot of comparative advantages? It's going to be very tough to develop. Okay, market stagnation. What if whatever you make, let's say coffee, there's probably 50 countries that make decent coffee. And what happens if you have a really good year in terms of production, and now there's a bunch of coffee that's flooded onto the world market? Think about how that's going to drop your prices. So, what happens if that occurs over a long period of time? Okay, next. If you want to develop and you're an LDC, unfortunately, you're going to have to depend a lot on MDCs. You're going to have to depend on them for things like, if you're a farmer, where are you going to get a tractor from? You're going to get one from an MDC. You need fertilizer. Where are you going to get that from? Oh, you're going to get it from an MDC. Let's say you want to get a bank loan from the World Bank as a country. You got oil and now you need to build the pipelines and everything, but you don't have the money to do it. Let's get a loan from the World Bank. Well, remember, who's putting in the bulk of the money in the World Bank? MDCs. So this creates a dependency on MDCs for these LDCs. And it's tough to kind of get out of that. Then there's going to be cultural costs. By doing what the rest of the world is doing, by what Americans are doing, it might it might take away from some of that folk culture that you have in that area. And then fifth, environmental costs. Think about like mining for, I don't know, coal or something like that. And you want to get the coal so that you can produce electricity so that your people can have heating. Well, unfortunately, when you burn that coal at the power plant, you're going to be creating smog. And so inevitably, you're going to have some sort of resource and environment destruction. You think about what's going on in the Amazon rainforest, where Brazil knows that there's lots of resources, gas and oil and gold and other things that are in the Amazon rainforest. And the only way you can get to them to some degree is by burning it down. So there are going to be environmental costs associated with the international trade approach. Okay, well, these are the major things that you need to know for the models of development. Thank you for tuning in.